Hi, I'm Ricky Frank. I've been enameling for 37 years. I make enamel jewelry and I'm a teacher. I love the way light passes through glass, and what I'd like to do is try to remove the intimidation from the process of enameling and make it so that you feel like you can enamel too. So for today's project, what we're going to do is do a cloisonné piece start to finish. Cloisonné-enameling means there's a wire separating color areas. It doesn't have to be very complicated, it just means there's a wire somewhere. So in order to do this, we're going to break this down into several stages. First stage is going to be preparing our canvas, which means we're going to take a piece of metal, put enamel on the front, put enamel on the back, and then fire our wires. And that's going to be the beginning. So to start with, we're going to use fine silver in this project. And what I've got here is a fine silver disc. This is 1 inch diameter, and we're working with 26 gauge silver. It could be thicker. I wouldn't go much thinner than this. So to start with, I'm going to put it on a ceramic honeycomb block and I'm going to heat it up, and that's going to anneal it, which softens the metal. When it's soft, I can shape it, give it a slight dome, and that's going to be the beginning. So I'm going to start with a little butane torch. Any type of flame will work for this if it heats the metal and anneals it. And I'm going to heat it up, moving it quickly just so it heats up quickly. And what I'm looking for is it's starting to turn slightly matte. Some people put a little bit of magic marker or Sharpie on there, but we can see it's turned slightly matte. Turn that off, get a nice long tweezer, and I can quench this in some water to cool it quickly. It's not going to hurt anything at all. And now this has been softened. I need to put a dome on it because when metal heats, it starts to warp. And putting a slight dome on it's going to help keep it from warping during all the firings that we're going to do. Because we'll probably be doing about 10 firings in this piece. I've made a little dapping block. It's got a slight dome in it by taking some jet set material, which is thermoplastic, and when it's put into hot water, it softens, and then I can shape it. So I've just put a light bulb on here to give it a slight curve. So I'm going to take my thumb, it's very soft because this is fine silver, and I'm just going to press it down. And then I'm going to even it out a little bit, and I am ready to go. So we saw that when I heated the fine silver, it turned white. Now if I had it polished and I put clear enamel over it, and I put it in my kiln, it would anneal again and turn white. So what I want to do is find a way to create a mirror finish on this throughout the firing process so it stays nice and shiny, reflecting light. So there are two different ways of doing this, but we're going to do them both with heat. One is going to be using a torch on this honeycomb, and one is going to be using a little ultralight kiln like this to heat the piece up. So while this is heating up, I will go ahead and put that on there, and I'm going to take my ultralight, my butane torch, and I'm going to heat the piece up until it starts turning orange, and then as it's getting hotter and hotter, I'm going to wait for it to literally melt on the surface, and there's going to be what I call a flash. So it's getting slightly orange now. And we can see it's starting to flash slightly. And keeping it going over the whole piece heats it up evenly. And that's looking pretty good. Let's get it all there. It's a little uneven. So I think what I'm going to do is heat it up more evenly in this hot plate kiln, because this is going to heat the whole piece up with the kiln, and then I can use the flame just to flash the surface. You can see how quickly it's heating up and much more evenly, and there we go. So I prefer using this ultralight kiln for this process. We're going to let it cool, and I'm not going to touch it with my fingerprints because we're going to be applying wet enamel, and water and grease don't mix. So I want to keep the grease from my fingerprints off of it. We're ready to move on to the next stage. So the next stage now is to put a clear layer of enamel. And what that's going to do is that's going to hold our wires when we get to the point of putting our wires in place. So let's touch it from the bottom, make sure it's not too hot because I don't want to get the grease on the front. By putting it on this steel block, it's almost like quenching it. It cools it very, very quickly. So the next step is going to be to fire a layer of clear enamel. In the enameling world, this is called Flux. Flux is colorless enamel. And to do this, I'm going to start with some Thompson unleaded enamel, and I'm going to use something called Transparent 2030. It's a medium fusing clear enamel. And I could use a hard enamel, but I always like to use either a medium or a harder fusing enamel as my base, because I don't want it to bubble up through my colors later on. So to get started, I'm going to grab a little cup, little plastic measuring cup, and I'm going to take a spoon and put a little bit of enamel in here. This is 80 mesh enamel, and what that means is that there are 80 little holes in a 1-inch screen. So all the enamel in here is small enough to go through those holes. That means that there are lots and lots of smaller grains too. Now, when you work with glass, and enamel is a type of glass, there are air bubbles when you melt glass. And what causes enamel to be cloudy is too many air bubbles. So when we have lots of little grains of enamel, there are going to be more air bubbles. So the way to get a nice clear layer of enamel, which I want on here, is to remove the fine grains. So one simple way to do this is to take some water, and you can use tap water if you don't have many salts. Here in Albuquerque, there's some salts in the water, and when I put that in here to clean it, I'm going to have a little bit of residue, and it's going to discolor the enamel. In other parts of the country, your tap water might be perfectly fine, so you just need to test it and see. So I'm going to put a little bit of some distilled or deionized or spring water, swirl it around, and we can see those fine particles in the water. And I'm going to do this enough times so that when I swirl it, the water stays clear, and what's happening is the larger grains are settling to the bottom. I feel like I'm going to put so much time into this piece, a couple extra seconds isn't going to hurt anything. So my next step is to fire a layer of clear enamel on here. So I've got to get this onto this piece. So I'm going to take a paintbrush. This is maybe anywhere from a 0 to a 1 or a 2. And I've got my cup of water here, and I've got my enamel here. And what I can do, because I'm using this cup, is I can tilt the cup and have either wetter enamel down here or drier enamel down here, and it gives me a lot of control. Because what's going to move the enamel is the water. And what I always try to tell my students is to find your water so that the right amount of water is on here so the enamel flows evenly. So I'm going to start with some onto the piece, and again, this is the 2030 unleaded enamel. And notice the angle of my hand is so that my brush is very horizontal. If I start going like this, I start poking divots into my piece. And I'm going to use some water to move the enamel. And what I'm looking for is a nice even coat. But instead of obsessing about it right now, I'm just going to consider this my layout process, and I'm going to try to get enamel on the piece, and then I'm going to go back and make sure it's not too thick or too thin. Because as I said before, too many air bubbles makes your enamel cloudy. And the thicker this layer, the more grains of enamel, the more air bubbles. So if I get it too thick, I'm going to have too many air bubbles, and it's not going to be clear. And what I'm looking for is it not to look white. So when it looks, I'm going to pull some over here. When I'm not seeing the silver color through, it's too thick. And where I'm seeing the silver almost bare, it's too thin. So what I'm trying to do is move the enamel, and I'm using just the tip of my brush with a very, very delicate touch. And I'm touching the highs so they flow into the lows, sort of like pushing the mountains into the valleys. Moving it out to the edge as close as I can get it without running over the edge. And if I want to be a little fancy, I can do a little tap and that settles it a little bit. And now I'm going to take a little bit of toilet paper and make a little twisty, and very, very gently I'm going to blot the water. And what I'm looking for is the toilet paper to stop moving or turning dark with the water. And when that happens, I know I have enough of the water out to fire it. Most books will tell you you have to dry this completely, and that is incorrect, because there's not enough water in here to steam up and ruin the enamel. And I'm pretty impatient. I like to move quickly through these pieces. So I'm going to get a firing screen. This is a little 4-inch stainless steel. This is a piece of fiberglass cloth, and these are wonderful for firing our pieces on. And I'm going to, very gently, you might use a little spatula to make it easier to get it on there, or even an index card or a postcard. And I'm going to put it on here. And I don't really need this firing cloth because there's no enamel on the back and it wouldn't stick to the screen. But it makes it nice and easy to do. So I'm going to put it in the kiln here, and I'm going to fire this enamel around 1300 to about 1450 degrees. I'm going to use a glove because this kiln's going to be hot when I open this door. I'm going to use a trowel I'm going to move my water because I always spill my water if I don't get it out of the way. I'm going to slide this in. I'm going to lift it straight up. I'm going to go straight in. I'm going to lower it straight. And then I'm going to remove my trowel straight so that I don't knock it over. And actually I can just remove this now too. This is so that I can put a hot screen and not ruin my table. I'm going to also wear some glasses that are treated to keep infrared light from giving me cataracts. If you just do a little bit of enameling, it's not going to hurt you. But I do a lot of enameling, so I wear these when I fire. And the important thing about firing is to understand, that there's not a right amount of time or a right temperature to fire at. It's an internal temperature. So when the piece reaches a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, the enamel will start to melt. And it's going to start to pull upon itself, so each grain will pull into itself and form a ball of glass, and we're going to call that sugar. Then the grains are going to start to melt and join each other and get slightly glossy, and that's going to be called orange peel. As they melt and get closer and closer to being smooth, that's a whole range of orange peel, and then it's going to become glossy. So for this first firing, we're going to fire this to glossy. And I'm going to put this in here. And generally it's going to take about 1 minute to 2 minutes. And I programmed this kiln for about 1450. As you can see, it's already dropped down almost 100 degrees. So it's going to start building back up. And of course, the longer I open this door, the cooler the kiln got, and the longer it's going to take. So if I'm firing at a lower temperature, it just takes longer. If I'm firing at a higher temperature, it's shorter. Every time I open the door, it cools. Sometimes you can get a kiln like this with a window and you can see in. If you can't see in, or even if you can see in and you can't see what's happening, you open the door, pull the piece out, and look, because that's the only way to know when you're done. So what I'm looking for is a glossy surface, and the screen is going to start to turn orange. And so let's just take a look right now. It's kind of sugary, but it's not glossy. So I'm going to put it back in, close the door. I try to be gentle so I don't knock anything. And it's just going to take a little while longer, but I do want to get a nice glossy finish on this first firing. So let's give it a look. It's almost perfectly smooth. There's a little bit of texture there. And if I run my trowel along here, I can see whether that texture is from the enamel or from the texture on the silver before I fired it. So we're going to let that be just right. And to cool it, I'm going to place it on this steel block and it will cool down very quickly. If I wanted to quench it, I could, but I would normally wait about 15-20 seconds so the enamel doesn't crack too much. And the next step is going to be something called counter enamel. So right now, I've got a nice dome, I've got a nice metallic surface, I've got a layer of clear enamel on here, and what's going to happen, the more enamel I put on the front here, the more stress is going to happen on this piece, because when I'm heating this piece up, the metal's going to heat, the glass is going to melt and expand just like the metal's expanding. When the piece cools, the metal starts to shrink, but the glass doesn't want to shrink. And there's a stress, and the glass is more likely to crack than the metal, so I start to get cracks. So a very thin layer on a piece of metal will be fine. Once I start adding more enamel, which I'm going to do, it's going to be too stressful. So what we're going to do is put enamel on the back, and we're going to call that counter enamel. So really any kind of enamel you want to use is going to be fine. And since I'm not worrying about this being clear, I'm going to take some unleaded opaque white, and this is undercoat white 1010, but you could really use anything. I'm going to sift this, and I'm going to use a trivet to fire this time, because if I put this on my screen, that enamel is going to melt and stick to the screen. So the trivet is going to allow the enamel piece to melt without having this stick to the screen. So I'm going to start with my mask. It's fairly easy to put a circle in a trivet like this, but if I had an odder shape, I would want to try to find out what position to put it in the trivet before I sifted, because what would happen is every time it would fall, I'd have to redo the sifting. So I always take my shape, put it in the trivet first before I do my sifting. So put my safety glasses on. And this is even more important because this trivet is a little more awkward than just laying a piece on the firing cloth. So I need to be very gentle, lifting up and close. So when I teach, I try to get my students to think about their goal. And the goal in this piece is to heat and melt the white enamel, which is on the back of the piece, which is facing side up. There's always something we're trying to achieve, and sometimes there's some things that we're trying to avoid. So what I want to avoid is having the enamel on the first firing, that flux gets so hot that it sticks to this trivet. And the oxidation from the stainless steel would make little black marks on the front. But I can't see the front. So I've got to figure out a way to be able to see what I'm doing and know when to pull it out. So if I know what my intention is, then I can think about how do I know when I've achieved my intention. Well, because I can see the enamel surface go from sugar to orange peel to glossy, I can look for it to turn orange peel and know that I'm not going to be firing it too long and I won't be melting the front. There we go. This is a little less orange peel than the first firing. But what we can see is there's a little bit of gloss there, but there's a lot of texture. So that's going to be enough right now to move to the next stage. So I'm going to let that cool. And let's just give it a few more seconds and I can quench it and I can move on to the next step. So the next step is going to be to put this enamel coat on the back, and I've already put some in a little cup here, and I'm just going to take a brush, and this is kind of like painting clay into my glass, because what it's going to do is seal the surface and make it so this back, when it's fired on here, is not going to be all glassy anymore, because if it was glassy, it would fire and stick slightly and create a texture. So just by painting this in place here, I try to keep it as thin as I can because it's only going to stick where it's touching the enamel. And I can just either put this on the kiln. Again, this is probably hot, so I'm going to be careful with that. Nice easy way is to just put it on here, put it on top of the kiln and let that dry, or if I've got something to do or work on some other pieces, I can just let it air dry and come back. So that's going to be the end of preparing what I call my fine silver canvas. I think of what we're doing as being a painter. So I've got my canvas ready, and the next step is going to be starting to do the design, which will be wire work and then color. I like to use several different techniques of bending wires. I hold tweezers in either hand, and my left hand becomes my holder, and my right hand becomes my shaper. I'm right-handed, and I'm always moving this way. So I'm going to start off by clipping a piece of wire so I don't have this big unmanageable string of wire flowing all over the work area. And the first thing I do, I'm going to call it a massage technique. And I use my left hand as my holder. And I'm going to have my right hand down, and it's going to have my tweezer at an angle around maybe 30 to 45 degrees. And what that does is it allows there to be quite a bit of the wire touching the tweezer. So I'm going to start by very gently squeezing between the two sides of the tweezer and moving my hand, and it's going to curve the wire this way. If I want to go the opposite direction, I will move slightly away from me this way, going that way, and it's going to curve the wire slightly away from me. It's being very gentle with a very delicate touch so that I don't put little crimps in it. And that's going to form a nice smooth curve. What I'm going to make is a little landscape, so I'm going to start forming some little hills. So I'm going to go ahead and just clip that a little long. It's always easier to clip off a little end of it if it's too long than to try to stretch it and make it fit. So we're going to put that there for now. Let's put it on the side, and I'm going to change to what I call the twist technique, and this is for creating angles. Same way of holding with my left hand. This time, instead of having my hand rest on the desk, I'm going to lift my hand, and the tweezer is going to go at a 90-degree angle, and I'm going to simply twist either away from me or towards me. And as I move along the wire, I will move my tweezer that's holding so I can get a nice sharp twist. I can do tight ones like this. And then if I want to, I can move my hand and let my finger be the holder. And I've got nice little angles. So combining these two, I can put a curve, and then if I want to have an angle, I will hold it and do my twist. And let's make a little mountain. And let's put a little curve here. And let's go ahead and clip this right here. And I think I'm going to use some of this because it looks kind of nice. I'm in Albuquerque and there are mountains in the background every time I look anywhere. So this is the Sandia Peaks in the background here. And I can stretch it or move it however, whatever works. And I can mark it with my tweezer. Clip it a little long because it's always easier to shorten it than to lengthen it. And it's fitting really nice there. And let's see how this one looks right here. I'm not really liking this. Sometimes I work with the drawing, sometimes I just freehand things. And I'm just kind of playing with the wire now and trusting my intuition. So I'm gonna let that be my landscape, and let's put another little series of hills. And that's going to be my landscape. I'm going to put a tiny little moon up here. But let's go ahead and put some glue on here to start with. I'm going to take my wire and dip it in. And all I need is a little bit of glue. Often a student will make the mistake and think that the glue is going to hold the wire in place the whole time. And they put lots of glue on. And then they come to me and ask me, do they have enough glue? And the thing to remember is the glue is just holding the wire in place onto this enamel surface until I get it into the kiln and the enamel melts. So my intention is for this enamel to melt and the wire will stick in place. The glue is just used to hold it in place until the enamel melts. So I don't need very much glue. Let's do that again because I forgot that I already had some glue there. And let's do this one. Just a little bit of glue. These wires are all slightly domed just from the way I've been curving them. So they're making pretty good contact. There are a couple little gaps here where the light's coming through and they're not touching the wire. And that's okay, because when it comes out of the kiln, I've got about 7 or 8 seconds when this enamel is still slightly molten. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little palette knife and touch them down very quickly, but very gently. And that will take care of some of these gaps. So creating the moon is going to be a little more complicated, and it's going to use a couple different techniques. So I'm going to start with a twist. Like this, and then I'm going to take a flat nose pliers and squeeze the tip, and that's going to give me a nice point. So this is one more technique I use. I use the massage for curves, I use the twist for angles, but if I want a really sharp point, that twist isn't going to get a sharp enough angle. So what I can do with a twist and a squeeze with the pliers is create a point. Like this. So I could integrate that point into any part of my design. The way I'm going to do it on this piece is I'm going to wrap it around this bezel forming mandrel. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to hold this in the palm of my hand like this, and my thumb is going to be able to rotate the mandrel. And I'm going to take the point is here, and I'm going to kind of judge how big I want this moon. The closer to the tip, where it's smaller, it'll be a smaller moon. So I'm going to put it right there and start to roll and bring this over. And it's looking a little small to me, so I'm going to stretch it up on the mandrel and make it. I've got a lot of space there, and all I'm putting is a moon, so I want a slightly larger moon. And I can wrap this around slightly, and then as I slide it off the mandrel very gently, I'm going to have a nice curve there. And now what I'm going to do is open this up slightly, spread this so I can get my tweezer in here, stick the point in the other end, and you can see as I'm doing this, it's really nice to have fine tips on these tweezers to get into these tiny spaces. And now I can just kind of nudge that moon open to create a nice little new moon. Touch it up a little bit. And now I'm going to take my beading scissors, and these are great because they cut right at the tip, and they're sharp enough to go right through two wires together, which is what I have right here. So I'm going to cut right where I want the end of the moon to be, right through both wires. And let's see what we've got. And that looks kind of nice there. And so I can now glue this on here, and that's going to be my mountain landscape. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue, touch it on, and I'm thinking about design and space and composition and how which angle I want it to be and how high up in the sky I want it to be. But there's not a right way. And this is ready to fire now. So what is going to happen is I'm going to put this in the kiln. The glue is literally, depending on how much glue I had on there, it's going to catch fire. I don't have enough glue on here where I'm going to see flames. But it's going to start burning and turn black, then it's going to turn brown, it's going to turn yellow, and then when that yellow disappears is how I'm going to know the enamel's melted. Then I'll pull it out, and I'm already aware that I've got a gap there, so I'm going to be looking for this space to touch down right there, and I'll probably touch these ends down a little bit, and I'll do a little touch on the moon, and that'll kind of seal those wires where there were gaps. What's nice about the blue stick is this doesn't need to dry, and I'm ready to fire this as soon as possible. If I wanted to, I could leave this for weeks and come back and fire it whenever I want. So the next step is going to be putting it in the kiln, and it's going to be the same amount of time as it takes for this enamel to melt. So again, I'm starting at 1450 in the kiln. When I open the door, it's going to cool slightly. Closing the door, it's going to start heating up again, and then every once in a while, I'm going to open that door, look and see if that glue is burned away, and when I think it's pulled and burned away, I'll pull it out, touch it down, and it's going to be ready to go for color. And that's looking pretty good. I don't see any brown on here. And I'm touching it. And I'm just going to go slightly from the side to make sure these wires aren't coming off. And it looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to let this cool. The next step is going to be applying wet enamel. And remember, water and grease don't mix. So if I get my fingerprints on there, touching it after it cools, when I try to get the enamel on to the surface, it's not going to flow evenly. So at this stage, I'm always keeping my fingers off, and I don't want to use my good tweezers to pick up something hot because I'm going to anneal the tips, and those nice tips of these good tweezers are going to get soft, and the next time you touch them to something, they're going to bend. So let this piece cool, and then get your colors ready, which will be the next step in the process, and we're going to be ready to do the fun part, which is getting the color on there. My wires are fired in place, and the piece is cool, and it's ready to start having the fun with the color. What I've got here are several cups of different colors. These are transparent, unleaded enamels, and I've prepared them the same way I prepared my Flux earlier. I wanted to get the fine particles out so the enamel is going to be as clear as possible without having tiny air bubbles throughout. So I've rinsed out the fine particles on all of these different cups. So these are ready to go now. And what I'm going to do is I've done a little color study here to see what these different colors look like over fine silver. This is over a pattern, but it still gives me an idea of the colors. Sometimes when I'm working, I do a color study, I do a painting, a color pencil study, and sometimes I just freehand things and work intuitively. And that's what I'm gonna do on this project. And again, I'm in Albuquerque, so I am going to just make believe everything here is green, which it's not. So I'm gonna start with my mountains, which are gonna be down here. And I'm going to start with darks on the top and work my way light. And actually, I think what I'll do as I think about this is going to be a dark sky, so I really want to have some contrast here. So I'm going to work dark and then light, and then as you're looking at the mountains, the closer mountains are going to look darker. So I'm going to start with a light yellow enamel. When I'm putting my colors on, you can always darken your colors, but you can't lighten them. What we're really doing is painting in thin panes of glass. And I can put a darker pane of glass over this and the colors will be slightly darker, but I can't put a lighter pane on it and make it darker. So I think of it as a watercolor doing washes, painting a layer, firing it, and then I can come back and darken it, or I can change the tint slightly, change the hue by adding another color. So I'm going to put just a little bit of green over on this side, and I'm going to brush and kind of feather this so it's blending together. And I'm trying to keep this thin, because remember, the thicker the layers, the more grains there are, the more air bubbles, the cloudier it's going to look. And I can really paint with this how I want. I can take little bits of color and put it where I want. I just want to keep it thin, and that looks great. So I'm going to take some of the same green, start at this end, and I've got a nice contrast there between the yellow and the green. If I had yellow next to yellow, I would lose that line and it would look like one big yellow shape. And I'm going to use another green. This one is 2305. And I'm not too worried about how this is looking. As long as it's staying thin and clear, I can come back on the next firing and change the colors. And I like the way that's looking. And I'm going to go slightly darker on this next one. This is a darker teal. So I've got a darker pane of glass. So if I have a thinner layer, it's going to be lighter in value, which will let more light through. So I'm going to keep this nice and thin. Wash my brush off. I tend to work a lot like this, where I'm trying to get my brush dry and keep it nice pointed. So I'm constantly going like this when I'm working. So let's work with the sky. Now I've got a small cell here and a big space here. So I try to do the small cells first, so in case I spill, it's easy to clean this up and there's no enamel there. So I'm going to start with a little bit of flux, which again is clear. And the trick to getting enamel into a small cell is to use the water. So I'm going to take a little bit of water and put that in the moon. Dry my brush slightly so I can pick up just a little bit of enamel out of my cup. And I'm going to use capillary action by touching the enamel to the water, and it's going to pull it right off my brush into the moon. And I'm going to tap it down a little bit. And now I'm going to work with my sky. And there's some beautiful sunsets here in Albuquerque, but I got a moon. And I really don't care because I love purple. So I'm going to start with a lighter purple towards the bottom. And again, I'm trying to keep it thin because I don't want air bubbles, because I want really bright, clear colors. And I'm tapering it down so that I can feather the next color in a little easier. And these are pretty close in color, and I know that I've got a darker purple that I can use later. So again, I'm thinking in layers. I'm not trying to get everything on this first layer the way it's going to look at the end. It's just a wash, and I want to get a basic layout of color, and I want to get a thin layer. Notice how I'm using the tip of the brush to move the water. It's nice and wet. If it gets too dry, I'm going to be chiseling it, trying to get the grains to move, and it becomes very frustrating. So if you have that problem, take a little bit more water on your brush, add a drop, and try to find your water. I'm going to take a little bit of toilet paper, one of my favorite tools, and very gently, so that I don't disturb the color, I'm going to start to blot the water out, and we can see that water moving through the piece into the toilet paper. And I'm going to take the other end and what I'm looking for is the toilet paper to stop moving. I can see that little tip of the toilet paper moving, and that means it's still absorbing water. And I'm being very gentle because I don't want to have to go back and replace missing grains. You see how that toilet paper moves? It's sucking up the water, and I think that is looking pretty good right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my screen, it's got the firing cloth, and I'm going to very gently, with my tweezer, put it on so that it's ready to go into the kiln. Some of these colors are a little sensitive to heat, and if I fire it too long or too high, they change color to a color I won't like. So I'm going to put it in the kiln. When I fired my wires on, I was looking for the glue to burn away. There's no more glue on there anymore. So what I'm looking for, and what I'm going to be looking for throughout this series of firings, are those firing stages where it's going from sugar to orange peel to glossy. And what I try to do is find my orange peel. So even if it gets a little glossy, I'm not going to the high end of glossy where I might be burning out my colors. So again, it takes a little bit of time, usually a minute to a minute and a half. And there are lots of factors. You can't just assume because it fired for a certain amount of time last time, it's going to be the same amount of time, because your kiln is different now than it was 30 minutes ago. If I was just in the kiln, it's going to be cooler. So I never assume it's a certain amount of time for firing. So I'm going to move these colors out of the way, and they're going to be ready for the next firing. And I'm going to pull my piece out, and I'm going to put it down on here to cool, and then I'm going to let the piece cool, and we'll be ready for our second layer. So let's take a little look inside the kiln. And that's looking pretty nice. I've got a little bit of a texture on there. I'm starting to see the colors come out, and they're light, and as the piece cools, those colors are going to change. Sometimes the greens look brown when I pull them out of the kiln. And one of the most exciting things as an enamelist is watching these colors change. It's so exciting to see these powders turn into glass, or into panes of glass, because they're already powdered glass. So as soon as this piece cools, I'm going to take a look at it. And now I've got a decision-making process to do. What do I want it to look like, and how do I get there? My piece is cooled down enough now where I can start adding another layer of color. If it's still warm, the water is going to start to sizzle and dry up, and the enamel's not going to move. So I really want to wait until the enamel's cool, and I want to remember not to get my fingerprints on it because the grease is going to get in the way of the enamel flowing. So I'm going to start this time with a little bit of water in the moon and just get that out of the way so I don't have to think about that later. So I'm taking a little bit more of the flux and letting the capillary action pull the enamel down, tap it a little bit to let it settle. And now I'm going to think about the colors. And to me, this cell is slightly boring. It's too yellow, and I really like colors gradating into another and flowing into one another. My work is like that, and I think it makes the pieces much more interesting. So I'm going to go back in with some green and do some shading here. And what I can do by going thicker to thinner, I can create a gradation of greens moving this way because it's a thicker green here than it is down here. And I want to make sure that this color here is not going to be the same color and value as there because I'll lose that shape. So I'm going to put a little bit more of that yellow. It's kind of a yellow-green after it fired. Notice how wet it is, so the enamel is flowing very easily. Clean my brush, get a nice little tip to it. And let's look at what colors I have here that I can use. And I've got like a medium teal here. This is 2430 and 2435, which is a little darker. So I'm going to take a little of the medium teal here, and I can control how much I put on my brush by how I tilt my cup. If it's too wet, it's hard to pull it out, so I will just grab it from the top where it's drier and use a nice little point of my brush to control how much is on there. And this is giving me a little shading effect here. And let's go back in with, I think I'll use the same green that I used before here. And I'm going to put a little bit more of that green over here. And then we used a kind of a very pale green before, so I'm just going to add that. Notice how free I'm being with the colors. You really don't need to be afraid. It's just glass and water. So if you don't think of it as precious, it's going to be fun. You're not going to be worrying about ruining it. It is not precious. It's only as precious as you make it. And I'm going to come in now, and I think I'm going to put a little blue in here, and that's going to change this color from being one solid layer of teal to a little bit of blue-green. So I think I'll do that at this end, and I'm going to go from blue from here over to teal there. So I'm going a little thick on this side and tapering it down. And then a little bit here. And this color, again, is a little darker. So I'm creating a darker pane of glass. So I really want to keep it thin if I want the light to shine through. And now I get to play with the sky. And it's a little wet, so I'm just going to blot it just a little bit to get some of the water out. And I'm going to start with the same colors. These purples, even though they look purple, they're still firing slightly peachy. And then I've got a darker purple that I didn't use before that I'm going to use up here to create a darker sky there. So I'm going to start with this lighter color here on the bottom. Just put a little bit. Before, on the first firing, it went up to here, but now I've got to leave room for the darker purple. And again, the darker your color, the lighter you need to go if you want light to come through. So I'm going to use a very, very thin layer, knowing that I can put a third layer on if I need to, or a fourth. But if I get it too thick now, I can't lighten it. And notice how right here where I'm tapering this dark into the light, I'm kind of creating a salt and pepper effect of mixing the grains. When enamel grains melt, they do not blend like watercolor paint or acrylic paint. You have isolated grains, and wherever you have a grain of purple is where you're going to get a grain of purple. But by mixing them slightly into sort of a salt and pepper look, your eye reads an optical blending of color, and it looks like they're blending together. The way to get a nice even layer here is to try to not have hills and valleys. Because if I have a hill of enamel, and I'll just do a little sample here, if I've got it too thick here, I've really got a thicker pane of glass. It's going to be a darker color, and it's going to look darker here than here. So one way to fix that is just to take a little bit of water and top it onto the mountain and push it into the low areas. Or if I wanted to, I could just scoop some off and just fix it. Again, it's not precious, it's just powdered glass. It's nothing to be afraid of. And as I'm working, I'm thinking design-wise too, because I've got shapes here. I've got a dark purple shape here and a lighter purple peach shape there, and I'm thinking about this line and what angle I want it to be and how crisp I want it to be. So I'm trying to feather it down into the horizon there. It's too wet to fire, because if I put this in the kiln just like this, the water would steam up and those grains of enamels would just start to fly all over the place. So just like I did on the first firing color, I'm using the toilet paper to blot out as much of the water as I can. And I'm looking for that toilet paper to move. And I don't want to take the paper from here and possibly have lifted some purple and put it in there. So I'll use a different piece of paper to touch different areas. See how that's moving like that? That's the water going up into the toilet paper. That should be good. Get my firing cloth, put it on there. It's ready to fire. I'm going to move my water so I don't spill it. And ready for firing colors number 2. And I'm looking for the same thing on this firing. I'm looking for the orange peel. So again, when enamel starts to melt, glass likes to melt into a ball. So a little grain wants to pull up and create a ball. So when the enamel starts melting, all those little grains start to crawl up into balls, and it looks like the surface of a sugar cookie. When there's more time-temperature relationship, it's building up an internal heat within the enamel, those grains, those individual grains, are going to start to melt into one another, and it's going to be textural like the surface of an orange. And as it gets hotter, it's going to smooth out, and if there's texture, there's still called orange peel until it's perfectly smooth, and it's going to be ready to pull out. So again, I'm looking for the orange peel so that I don't overfire it. Oh, that's looking good. And you can see there's a little bit of texture on there, especially up here. And so what we've seen is we have a little bit of orange peel here, and it's kind of glossy here, so it's quite possible that this purple melts at a higher temperature than the other colors. And that's why it's still orange peel. So we're going to let that cool down, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take a look. I can still add color. There's not a right way to do it. I have to make choices. This is the artistic creative process here. I can darken colors, and I can slightly change the hue. I can't take a red and make this a red now, but I could put a blue and darken it and make it a teal. I could put a red over this and make the purple a little more of a red, but I'm getting limited as to what I can do. So it's better to kind of plan this out in the beginning. So let's let that cool. We'll take a look at it, make some choices, and proceed to the next step. So we've got our second layer of color fired on here, and now I need to think about, do I want to change it, or do I want to start putting on thin layers of the clear enamel, which we call Flux? I'm thinking the sky needs a little bit more dark into it, so I'm going to put another layer of some of this dark purple, and this is number 2780. This is a Thompson unleaded enamel. So I can go slightly over where I did before. So I'm bringing this sky, this dark sky, down around the edges now. So I am making a design change in here. And then I'm going to be putting clear in the rest of the areas because I like the way they look, but I have to consider the thickness. Because just remember, when you do thick layers, you get air bubbles, and I want to keep this nice and clear. And that's what attracts me to enamel, is the way that light's going through the glass. And I don't want to do anything to get in the way of that brilliant reflected light. So I'm going to take my flux and do a thin layer. And to me, a thin layer means that I can see the color coming through the flux. Here it's white, it's too thick. Here I'm able to see this color. So as I don't want to get it too thick, it's okay to get it too thin, because all I'm doing now is putting a layer of clear glass on it, and an uneven layer of clear glass looks the same. It doesn't change the color. So I just want to make sure it's not too thick. Too thin is all right. Because what I'm going to be doing is building up lots and lots of layers until I reach the height of the wire, and then I begin the grinding and polishing stage, and I become a lapidary artist. And this could take anywhere from 3 to 6 firings. It depends on how much color you had there in the beginning, and it depends how thick your layers are, and it also depends on how tall your cloisonné wire was, because the higher your wire is, the thicker your enamel is going to have to be to get to the top. So I just want to make sure it's not too thick. It doesn't need to be even. And what I'm trying to avoid is any areas that might look like this where it's looking white, because those areas are going to fire cloudy. So this just becomes a tedious process of firing, cooling, and repetitive, repeating it until you get to the top. So blot, fire, cool, and repeat. Fire and cloth, and into the kiln again we go. And I've got the colors looking dark, and as you can see here, there's quite a bit of texture on here. So it's at very low end of the orange peel, but I can see the color coming through, so I know the grains have bonded together and started to smooth slightly. So I'm going to keep it at this stage until I get to the last firing, and then I'm going to fire it the same temperature but for a longer time, and so it gets smooth and slightly glossy. About to start the third layer of flux, and since it's so grainy here, it's going to take a little bit more water. Otherwise the enamel is not going to be smooth. So I'm just going to pay attention to that water. Again, finding your water so that when you just touch your brush down to the water, you're moving your grains. I had a student once tell me that I really wasn't teaching him to enamel, I was teaching him how to move rocks. And I'm keeping it thin so I'll have clear layers. When I'm working in my own studio on a series of pieces, I generally am working on 1 or 2 or 3 pieces with color, and then I wait until I have several pieces and I do the fluxing all at once, because this is kind of mindless and I can put a lot of pieces on the screen and fire them all at once, and it takes less time for grinding. So let's blot the water and into the kiln another time. Onto the firing cloth. Okay, so let's take a look and see if this is smooth now. And it's looking smooth, and what I'm looking for is if I can see highs and lows. So we're going to let that cool, and then I'm going to take my tweezer. Again, I don't want to put a good tweezer on a hot surface because I don't want to anneal the tips and ruin the tweezers. And I'm going to see if I can feel highs and lows. If there are some low areas, I'm going to put a little bit more flux in those areas before I start the grinding process. So we'll give this a little bit of time to cool, and we'll come back and take a look at it. As I look at this surface now, I can feel it being low down here. I can also see it kind of concave, the way the light is bouncing off of this. So I'm going to do one more layer, and again fire it to smooth. And that should be enough. Now if I have high areas, I don't want to keep adding more enamel because I'll have to grind that off. But I think that I've been doing such thin layers that one more layer over everything is going to be just right. So it's looking good. Be a little more gentle. And this should be the last time in the kiln. And this will be fired to glossy once more. And we'll let that cool. We've got the enamel up to the height of the wire. It's a little low there, but I think that the grinding is going to smooth that out. So anything that works to grind the surface of glass is going to work. What I'm going to use is a diamond pad, and what I've done is I've taken a mandrel with a rubber base here, and I've made a little attachment with some sponge and some dual lock, which is similar to a Velcro, and I've got a diamond pad on there. And we want to do this with water. So I'm going to wanting to be getting the wires ground and the enamel ground as well. So I'm going to go very slowly to start, and I'm going to begin just by grinding down the edges of the wire. And I'm going to keep doing this wet, very gently and not too fast. And remember, the piece is domed, so I want to keep it going over the dome. If I go straight through the center, I'm going to drill a hole of color right through the middle. And what we can see here are the wires beginning to become exposed, which means there's no enamel on them. And as you can see, some of the enamel started to become matte, and that's where the sandpaper has ground it down. Now it's hard to see unless you dry it, and you can see the shiny areas is where the tool has not hit the glass, and the matte areas is where I've abraded it. So I'm going to continue with this process, keeping the dome. When you're first doing this, you need to be fairly careful that the piece isn't going to fly out of your hand, and that you're making nice long strokes so that you don't put facets into your piece. And as you can see now, I'm trying to dome the piece slightly. And that's feeling good, and it's looking good. So I'm just going to ignore that tiny little glossy spot there. It's so slight that no one's going to notice it when I do the polishing. So the next step is polishing. This was grinding. This was removing enamel. This was smoothing everything out and shaping it and getting the enamel off the wire so that everything is level. But it looks very matte now because we have worked a 200 grit sandpaper on it. And it looks very frosty. So I want to get this polished. Now there's several ways of doing this. One way would be to take finer and finer sandpapers and remove the deeper scratches. But that's going to take a little long for me. And so another way is going to put a fire polish on that. And what that means is to put this back in the kiln, let it get hot again. All these scratches and pits are going to melt and everything will get smooth and shiny again. But now it'll be level and the wires will be exposed. But I've got a little bit of problem. As we can see, the white that was on here is not clear water, and that's lots of little bits of this enamel that's been ground off, and the surface is pitted. So that white is getting into the enamel. This is the ground enamel. And if I don't clean this off, when I fire it, it's going to fire as a gray sheen over the whole piece and look really crummy. So what I've got here is a glass brush. It's got tiny little blades of glass. You want to be careful that you don't get these in your finger. And we are going to scrub. It would actually make sense to do this with some really clean water, but I think this is going to be okay. I usually take this to a sink and do it over the sink with clean water. You can't really see anything happening. It's microscopic, removing those bits of grit. So we've got that. We can put that right on. I can touch it with my fingers because I'm not putting wet enamel there. And I don't have to worry about the grease. So we're going to have one firing. Hopefully this will be the last one. Into the kiln. It can be at the same temperature. It doesn't need to be higher or lower. And I don't have any fresh enamel on there right now, so I can't watch it go from sugar to orange peel to glossy. So what I'm looking for now is to see all those little pits and scratches perfectly smooth. So it was pretty matte, so I'll see it get shinier and shinier. I'll open the door and look to see when I think it's smooth, pull it out, hold it under the light here so I can see up close, and if I see any little pits or scratches, back into the kiln until it's smooth again. So let's take a look. And it looks very nice. I don't really see any pits and perfectly smooth. We're going to let that cool and then we can make a decision whether we're going to leave it like that, and that could be our final piece, our final firing. A lot of enamelists leave it like this, or we could take it one step further, which is what I like to do. So let that cool for a few minutes until I can hold it in my hand, and we'll move to the final polishing step. The enamel's cooled, and as I look at it and tilt it in the light, I see a little bit of glare, and that's the part I don't like personally in a gloss kiln polish finish. So what I'm going to do is take, this is 15 micron or 600 grit. It's on a piece of, actually 2 painter sticks glued together, and I'm going to hit it with some sandpaper, and I'm going to do this wet, and it's going to just slightly take some of that shine off. It's very, very, very fine grit sandpaper, and let's see what it looks like. Much nicer. It's kind of satiny now. So I'm going to do it the whole piece. There we go, and hopefully you can see that it's not as much glare on the piece. I see a little bit over here. So I'm going to do it just a little bit more. And then just to spice it up a little bit and make it a little shinier, it's not going to affect the glare, but it's going to make the colors nice and transparent. I'm going to take a polishing compound called ZAM, which is made for polishing glass and stone. And just touch it up slightly, and that will make it perfect. I've also used something called Fabuluster. So I've got my flexible shaft and my ZAM. I'm going to take a dust mask. It doesn't need much, so really just touching it will do it. And this polishing is the last step. So what we've done to make this piece is we prepared our canvas, we shaped our fine silver, got our flux, got our counter enamel on, then we put our wires on and fired it. We painted our color layers, fired those, we fired our layers of flux, building it up to the height of the wire. Then we ground it smooth, fire polished it in the kiln, and then touched it up with a little bit of sandpaper and sand to give it a nice, satiny, smooth finish. And this piece now would be ready for setting. I like to set my pieces in bezels, and the bezels would come over the edge slightly and the piece would look wonderful. So for more information, go to riogrande.com or call 1-800-545-6566.